I hear the ding. So today's presentation is on injury screening in powerlifters. The reason I started doing this presentation and putting it together is because Kum actually put a message in the group chat way back when, with a video of a different physio on a different powerlifting team going through specific things that is within a coach's scope of practice that you guys could be screening for in an onboarding process to do with injury risk. I want to make it abundantly clear throughout the whole presentation, it seems a little bit negative. It's not negative, hence the reason why we'll be doing big discussion at the end and why I've left enough time. It is just, is movement screening for injury risk the best thing that we could actually be doing, or is screening for other things actually more beneficial, and when is the best time to be doing the injury screening to make the biggest impact to our athletes? So the first thing that I wanted to go through is we can't screen what we can't define. And unfortunately, in the literature, defining injury risk or injury in general is extremely hard for people to agree on, because injury is quite a broad topic. So the first thing is, what are we actually looking for? And if we are going to be screening our athletes, what are we telling our athletes that we are screening for, and what the injury risk actually is? So are we looking at what some research articles define injury as: time lost, subjective pain, or probably my favorite out of the three really is structural damage to actually define injury. They all have their issues. So when it comes to time lost, many lifters will train through pain anyway. And so when we're looking at the research and what they're defining injury risk as, they aren't actually looking at individuals within their data that are injured but are still training. Then you've got subjective pain, but we know that subjective pain doesn't necessarily mean structural damage. So again, when research articles are looking at these lifters, they may be looking at people who have pain but aren't necessarily injured in a different context. And then the last one is structural damage. So again, as I said, probably my favorite definition out of the three, but we know that symptoms aren't always correlated to structural damage, in the terms of if you're going to look at someone, let's say with a disc herniation, some people with an extreme disc herniation will have way less symptoms than someone with a minor disc herniation. Not that any are particularly minor, but those symptoms don't always correlate. And so what we're looking for is injury risk, and what we're actually screening for in the questions that we're asking can really differ. And now the reason why that is so important is because language and the way that we talk to our athletes is extremely important in this context, because if we're going to be screening for injury risk and we're telling an athlete that they are at high risk, well, what are they at high risk of? Are they at high risk of losing time to the sport? Are they at high risk of having pain? Are they at risk of having actual structural damage that we need to be very aware of? And so if we were to go back to a lifter after a screening process and say, okay, you're at a high injury risk, often they can hear, okay, I'm broken, I'll stop now. And that is definitely not what we want. We want people to not be fear avoiding different movements, because if we end up telling people that they, in their heads, what they've heard is, I'm broken, they may adapt their movements to try and prevent them from getting injured in the first place. They may adapt the things that they're doing that you haven't programmed. They may be changing their program outside of what they're consulting with you. And that can end up making more problems than what the screening form ever, or the screening that you were conducting ever had the intention of doing. So the other issue with screening in general is that even when we do agree on a definition, the tests that we then use to screen lifters, or to screen anyone for that matter of fact, often don't make very good sense as to what we are screening for. So a great thing that I've seen in the research that is more probably recent is that our tests for ACLs, and don't get me wrong, ACL isn't a common injury when it comes to powerlifting, but when we are screening for our testing, when we're looking at injury risk with ACLs, is usually what your knees do when you are landing. And we say that the people who have got a high ACL injury risk will have more knee valgus. The people who have got no ACL risk have got just more of a typical landing response where your knees stay fixed and tracking over your toes. But then when you're looking at the research and you say, okay, well, the people who have got ACL injuries and the people who don't, it actually looks more like a normal distribution curve rather than a positive distribution curve. And so the tests that we're doing to screen these people to tell them, oh, well, you're at risk of injury of your ACL isn't even valid in the first place. And so this is like where I'm sort of getting on to, okay, well, if you're going to be doing screening with your lifters, what tests are you using? Are they valid tests? Or are we going to be starting to use not these tests that are typically seen in the research? Are we going to be developing our own tests in the first place? So if we're not going to be doing specific testing, are we just going to look at technique? So this is probably where more of the video that Kim originally put into the chat probably went through a bit more, where they were looking at what can coaches do to look at technique in the first place to either correct when we start training or to correct later on and keep in the back of their mind. Unfortunately, with technique, that everyone will have their own opinions on it. We could discuss it later. But there is no evidence to suggest that there is any correct technique. Yes, you can be making that technique more efficient for that lifter specifically, but we will all have our biases on what technique looks right based on what feels right to us. And so if we are starting to make corrections in people's programming, which I'm sure hopefully none of you do anyway, but if other coaches were to start making corrections on people's programming based on what they think is the correct technique, again, you can be looking at altered movement patterns for that lifter that actually isn't natural to them and create more problems than what we ever intended in the first place. The other things to consider is the fact that elite lifters break the rule. We've all seen the elite lifters who have got a crazy knee valgus, their knees are touching when they're doing squats. They don't necessarily get injured. Yes, again, I've got my own opinions on that. But when it comes to the majority, it's not necessarily a problem and the research doesn't show it. So I can't sit here and say that it is an issue. And then also the textbook lifters get hurt too. The people who we would see as a perfect example of technique will also get injured. And that shows us that technique isn't necessarily the thing that we need to be screening on initial onboarding or at any point in your programming. So if you're not going to look at technique, what are you going to look at? Next is sort of like the fight for which one you should look at next, I guess, which is then the programming versus pathology sort of argument. I've got the quote here. Oh gosh, I'm going to struggle to read it because you guys are there in front of it. When a lifter develops shoulder pain from bench press volume, the question is not, does this athlete need rotator cuff strengthening drills? The question should be, is the tissue being asked to do more than it currently can? So what we currently see way too often, in my opinion, is someone gets a shoulder injury and we go, okay, implement all of these things within your program. Here are all the rehab exercises that you need to be doing. And what we don't do enough is go, well, what was happening in the first place that created this injury, or not necessarily created, but contributed to this injury. And so when you are screening an athlete / having a conversation with an athlete in the onboarding process, you want to be looking at things like, what did your previous coach give you? What have you been doing in your own training if you haven't been coached? Was there a period in time, if you are now experiencing pain, where that tissue that is injured was overloaded? And is there an obvious point in time where that there is overload? So you can start to see where you aren't getting the RP is staying the same, but intensity is continuing to increase in a bad way, not the other way around, where the athlete's actually getting better. And then also, have you started working a tissue too much too soon? Is there a point in time where you've had a big growth spurt in strength, you've got pain, but because you've seen a big increase in strength, you've just continued to run with it, forgetting the fact that things like tendons don't develop as fast as muscles do. And so you're pushing that athlete past their tissue capacity. Then the other things that you can look at in a screening process is then the actual pathology. Say, have you had an acute injury? Is this got nothing really to do with programming in the first place? Did you misplace where your ankle was when you were walking out of squat and now you've rolled your ankle? Is there anything that needs to be changed in my programming because of the screening, because of a previous injury? Have you got a genuine weakness that needs strengthening? And have you got a genuine mobility restriction that needs improving? Now, these are two that I've put genuine in front of specifically because it needs to be genuine. And the way that you can figure that one out is because the athlete will tell you. It is not something where you say, do you think you've got any weaknesses between the two sides? And they go, well, maybe I've got a bit of a rotator cuff issue on one side and maybe it's like a little bit less rotation here. Maybe I can't get my arm as high up on one side as I can on the other. if there isn't any pain in the first place. It needs to be obvious. It needs to be the lifter turning around to you and saying, this is causing me an issue. I can feel there's a weakness. I can feel there's a mobility restriction, and therefore it's causing pain. This isn't something that we need to be screening for and adapting programs if it is not something the lifter has brought up, or isn't something specific that you have caught during their first initial conversations with you. So this is now where we get to sort of the real evidence that is coming out in the research, and hopefully that we all do know. My big thing here that I've become more passionate about through researching for this presentation is I think that we all overlook externals way too often when it comes to onboarding athletes. I'm not necessarily sure about you guys. I believe in you guys way more than I believe in other coaches. So I just wanted to run through this in a little bit more detail, because these things are important, and we need to be asking more questions about them than what I think we do, because we see these parts as basic and we see them as things that people should know through common sense. So we all had the call last week, and I've also got a next slide where I'll talk about nutrition more, but we know energy availability and protein intake directly affect tissue repair and training adaptation. We should all know this. We all know that nutrition has a big impact on people's injury risk, and if people aren't fueling enough, then they are at a higher injury risk, and the research across the board supports that. And that is way more impactful than looking at which leg is weaker, is looking at their nutritional intake and looking at how that affects their training. Again, I'll talk about that more on the next slide, but I'll skip on for now to sleep. Now, sleep, again, we all know the importance of sleep, but it's something that I feel like we brush over way too quickly with our athletes. And I think I'm very, what's the right word? I can accuse myself of it as well, of brushing over sleep, because it's something that we feel like we can't fix. It's something that we say, well, you've got to try and clean up your sleep hygiene, try and put your phone down for 15 minutes beforehand. And I think, although yes, that information is important to like try and get across to an athlete, actually just telling them the level of injury risk that they could be putting themselves at, they need to be sorting out their sleep if they are going into training high intensity in powerlifting. This is a great research article to look at if you want to read any of them on here, is the one at the bottom of sleep in 2020. Just one of the statistics that I pulled out is chronic sleep restriction increases injury risk by up to 1.7 in youth athletes. Again, it's just one statistic, but it shows you how important sleep is to recovery and to injury risk. Again, super important to acknowledge way before any movement screening. Then psychological stress. High life stress combined with low coping resources is a significant injury predictor. Again, a really good article. This comes to, I think I potentially referenced it in my previous presentation. I think it's something like, and I wish I had the actual statistic, but if you are unsafe, if you feel unsafe in your training environment, your injury risk increases by 80%. I'm sure that's the right statistic, but I don't know where I've got that from. So take it with a pinch of salt. These things, in just terms of stress, have a much bigger impact on our injury risk than we think, usually because of decision making when we're under stress and it being limited. If you're going into a gym and you're not feeling safe and you're focusing on everyone else in the gym and not yourself, you will make incorrect load selections. You will not focus on the technique that you should be focusing on. You won't be focusing on focus points, and it can increase your injury risk way more, again, than movement screening. So something that you need to be asking your athletes is, are you feeling safe? Is there any stress that's going on at home that would be affecting your cognitive skill? Again, these are all questions that you can have in your onboarding process. And then occupational load, again, something that I hope that you guys talk about is like people's jobs and what they're doing outside of their 2-hour slot in the gym. If you're not taking into consideration what they're doing as a job, specifically if they're a laborer, if they have a physical job, then you need to be asking them how much physical activity they're doing outside of the gym will impact your programming seriously, and not just a small change here or there. So onto nutrition. It wouldn't be me without a pelvis in the presentation, would it? So when it comes to nutrition, the reason I just wanted to give it a little bit more time of day is because I think, again, when we're going through nutrition can look really good from the outset, and you can go, okay, how many calories do you want? 2,500, fantastic. Or you can go, is your hydration good? Yep, drink 2 liters. We know that nutrition isn't the same for all athletes. And if we are seeing that nutrition looks good, but then we are also having symptoms that come up here on the presentation, things like fatigue, weird decision making. You can ask, are they having irregular menstrual cycles, stress urinary incontinence? All of these things can be because they've got issues with their nutrition and can be addressed. This is the point in time where the screening isn't necessarily for you guys to manage, but is for you guys to tell your client to go to a nutritionist or go to a GP to get checked. I've said before, and I will say again, REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. If you don't know about it, research it. It's a huge topic at the moment in pelvic health, but also across all physio. And so it's something that you guys should know about. Even if you just look up what that wheel is, just put REDS wheel, and just have a look at the other symptoms that sort of come up more regularly as to why we need to be looking at the nutritional intake of our athletes and what symptoms can come up if they're not getting adequate nutrition. Next. So what if we're going to look at all of these? We've been through your movement. We've seen that movement maybe isn't the best thing to be screening. And then we move on to all of the other external things. What are these sort of questions that you need to be asking your athletes? So this is a slide that I put in for you guys to sort of refer back to if you want to. What are your beliefs about technique? This is one that I wanted to touch on because it's something I've come up against with a couple of guys of mine recently. People's views in their family have a massive impact on how they navigate injury. If they have got a family who have said you shouldn't be lifting with back pain, or a algorithm on social media that is constantly telling them that you need to be doing these magic exercises to fix your pain, and they're now spending 2 hours trying to mobilize with all of the Instagram exercises that they've previously seen, this is something that you can address really quickly. And again, just provide education on. You can continue moving through pain, providing that you've got a plan towards where you are going. You can continue pushing yourself. You don't need to be afraid of spinal flexion when you're deadlifting. We all know these things, and not all of your lifters will. And so deliver that information when you can. How is your sleep, stress, and nutrition? What we've just discussed, making sure that you're going through all of those questions. What is your training history and sports background? Again, training history seems like an obvious one. Sports background, maybe not necessarily. So training history, yes, you can go through, yes, injury risk, what they have, what previous injuries they have. But if you're looking at someone's previous sports background, specifically if they were doing sports as a kid, such as dance or gymnastics, where they are really mobile and really have taken their muscles and joints to limits, they may come up against a higher injury risk than the average person that's sort of coming to us. And so it's just another question that you can just add to your remit. So if they are getting sort of aches and pains when they're doing narrower stance squats, narrower stance deadlifts, sumo deadlifts, oh, maybe that's because they've actually trained their body for the past 15 years of their life to live in external rotation, and maybe we should actually favor that because it probably is beneficial to them. And then, are there any niggles that you're going through right now? Ask that question, because if you can pick up on a couple that can be fixed really easily just through some quick, here's how to warm up, here's the exercises like banded pull aparts that you can do, you might as well fix a 2 out of 10 knee pain before it becomes a 6 out of 10 knee pain. It seems obvious, but again, not something that everyone will ask. Then this is probably, if you take one thing from this presentation, take this one. Fear of movement is the injury that we create. Now, the reason I say that this is because when you're screening, overdiagnosis is not misdiagnosis. There are many things that may come up in your screening or in your conversations with your athletes, where you're just screening anyway, like you should all be doing every day, that you could diagnose and are or not necessarily diagnose, but tell your athlete is an issue or needs to be corrected, that isn't necessarily incorrect, but is not helpful. If you are telling an athlete that they have got, oh gosh, I've got to come up with a couple now. Guys, help me. If you're telling an athlete that they are doing, let's say, they've got a narrower grip on their bar than what you would necessarily suggest. They've got a wider stance squat than what you would necessarily suggest. If they are doing 3 more exercises in their mobility, such as leg swings, which I've got, I hate anyway, but if it works for them, you don't need to tell them not to do it because it might create a risk of injury. It creates fear of movement, and that is the crux of it. If you are then trying to create an improvement and then you are actually creating fear, you will end up with more issues than what you're trying to achieve. And the other thing that you should note about this slide is that the current injury data that they do about, I want to say every 5 years, where they go through all of the sports and they see how many injuries each sport has per 1,000 hours. Powerlifting has currently got 4.4 injuries per 1,000 hours. That is unbelievably low. If you are correcting the small things that you don't need to, you are correcting stuff that just doesn't need to be corrected. If no one ever got injured in powerlifting, it'd be fantastic for everyone else, not for me. No, I'm joking. It would be an issue because people wouldn't be training hard enough. And this is the issue with overcorrection: is as soon as you start overcorrecting things, people then become hypervigilant and people stop moving and pushing themselves to limits. And that is when we start to see people not achieving the potential that they could. When you compare this data to things like rugby, things like football that have 25 injuries per 1,000 hours, 8 injuries per 1,000 hours, there's differential data there with between sports. With powerlifting, we don't need to be that worried. We don't need to be bringing it up. And so again, you can be asking your athletes, okay, well, what have you been previously told by other coaches? What have you been previously told by healthcare professionals to correct? Because actually things that people have previously corrected before you may not be what you want to be doing now. Actually them going back to what was natural to them in the first place may feel better to them rather than listening to their I'm actually going to change my choice of words, listening to their previous coach who wanted them to go into a different stance when actually the previous one felt fantastic, or wanted them to change shoes from flats to heels when it didn't need to be done. So after all of that, when is the best time to be screening your athletes? So in my opinion, there is absolutely no research behind this whatsoever, but in my opinion, post-comp is probably the best time that we want to be screening our athletes. Not on onboarding. Throughout this whole presentation, I've been like, on onboarding, maybe when you're doing it in onboarding. I don't think that's the right time to do it because you don't have enough trust with your athlete. And if you start telling them, oh, here are all of your injury risks right at the start, they won't trust you even more. And they will be really, I want to say, worried about telling you about any injuries that then come up in the future through fear of you telling them, oh, you're doing something wrong again. And so build up that level of trust with your athlete through a comp season. Obviously, if they don't compete, it's a different story. But build up a good level of rapport. Post-comp is when they're going to be at their highest psychological stress, if there's big goals coming up, potentially at their lowest nutritional intake, highest fatigue state, at their highest intensity. After this is a fantastic time to review what worked, what didn't work, what can we now change based off of evidence. You've then got a whole pool of evidence that has actually worked or not worked. You can then start changing things rather than in your onboarding going, I think this might work, I think it might not. And so that is sort of my take on it. It's when if I'm using my screening form, I'll message people after a comp to say now's a good time if you want to. So there are all my references. I want to discuss. The big thing that I want to discuss at the moment is you guys will have seen that I have a screening form that the athletes now currently have access to. I wanted to just bring on the conversation because at the moment that screening form costs £20. Now, because it was taking me hours to go through those screening forms and provide a load of information on here are the different things that you can do and why you should be doing them to prevent your injury risk. Based on the research that I've now done, I'm not really sure I want to be doing screening forms and giving advice based off of things that aren't actually necessarily a problem yet. And so what I'm thinking about doing and wanted your opinions on is, do I make that form free for athletes, let's say when we get the new document out. So everyone can do it, and it gives us a reference point. So if athletes then become injured in the future, we can go back to their screening forms. Let's say I implement things like movement screening, and then we find out what their normal was before they were injured. And so, because what can happen is people get injured, they don't know what they were like beforehand because they never thought about it. And so we never have a reference point as to what was their normal and what was working for them. And so I'm thinking if we get all of that data in one point on the screening forms, it's on my system, then if they want an appointment later on in the future, then we can go back to that. It saves me time in appointments because then I've got a load of data already. And then we can get more onto movement testing rather than an entire initial appointment being about what your previous injuries like, what's your history, what was your movement like before it. So yeah, that's my baseline discussion point. And then we can discuss any other questions that you guys have got. Feel free to put your hands up, discuss.
Actually, Lucy, if you want to jump in first, you're all good.
Sorry. So just out of curiosity, when is it that you initially want that screening for a athlete? Me, for example, if I did that when I first joined up, that would be like 3 years ago. I might have learned a lot and things might have changed in that period of time. In fact, I know that things have changed in that period of time. I'm quite proud to say that things have changed a lot in 3 years. So kind of that information then wouldn't be relevant if I came to you today. So at what point do you want our athletes to screen? Is it something that we want to implement, say, like every 3 months, and then we just basically refer back to the most recent screening that they have done? Or are we going to do it like at the end of a comp or like at the start of a new prep? Where is it that you see the most benefit for our athletes to do the screening, and when?
So at the moment, I would say every 6 months is probably the best because you're going to see quite a lot of change within a 6-month period. And not too much where the athletes are then going to start thinking, oh my God, I've got to do this flipping form again. But also it's not then taking a whole year where an awful lot can then change and actually a lot can sort of come up. So I'd say every 6 months, ideally as from when they do on board. Again, it wouldn't be me giving advice based on the screening that they've done. It would just be we've got a data point, and then every 6 months on from that, they get a reminder saying, can you recomplete this, please? Or if they are already on board and everything is up to date, then it will probably be from when we transfer people onto the new document, because I'll just put a link on the rehab tab.
So the thing I was going to say is actually a follow-up to that, which first of all, I completely agree with the 6-month point, right? Because it gives us what's changed in that time frame, even if you didn't see it for 2 years and you've got like many data points between those points. I do think there should be a massive differential between self-diagnosis and practitioner diagnosis, and then specification of who the practitioner was or what qualification they had. Because one of the things, I wrote a lot of notes. There's a lot of points I'd like to go through. One of the things I wrote down is self-diagnosis is bullshit, which is not overly detailed. But the amount of people that would fill in that form, that we would take it as gospel, being like, oh, you had a rotator cuff tear, that's pretty significant. And being like, who diagnosed that? No one, and that wasn't real. And I think it's pretty significant to have on those forms, if it's just for data, the validity of those points, because that's probably the single biggest issue I face is self-diagnosis.
I'm going to note that down in the athlete screening form. Thank you.
But I would genuinely also like, if this offends anyone on the call, I apologize. If it offends anyone else, I don't particularly care. The type of practitioner who is qualifying that, of it being like, oh, this was my massage therapist. Like, I don't care offensive. It's completely irrelevant. And if it's okay, we had a physio, and also because obviously across nations that is different. So physical therapist in America versus physical therapist in the UK, very different skill set. So I just think they would be really valuable things to know the difference on.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Callum and his notes.
I have a lot. I I'm going to ask questions that are kind of open-ended then that can lead to more conversation, because there are a fair few bits. Because one of the things, the what is risk and then losing time, I want to come back to, of like, because you and I have discussed this a lot about at what point even diagnosing appropriately and accurately is not losing time, it's losing people in the sport. I'll come back to that one. But the other one, we talked about externals being significantly more impactful than people give credit to. But one of the things that I think coaches get wrong or don't know the answer to is, what lever do you pull first? So do you try to address the external on the assumption that you trust that the individual will do that, or do you adjust the training first in lieu of them doing those changes?
Well, that's a hard question, isn't it?
That's kind of for everyone as well, I'll say. So it's not like absolutely want your take, but I would like everyone's take.
I guess it's to be honest with in my opinion, honest with the athlete. Say, it's up to you basically. Do you want to really go for it and change this external? And do you want to be the best that you can? Or do you want me to change your training? It won't make you, we can try and adapt. It won't be as good as what it would be if you were to change the external in the first place. And you have control over that. It's your training and you can decide. It is then down to them and their choice as to whether or not they want to change or not change. I would say if you've got a thought as to whether or not they are probably not going to change the external, I would change the training slightly anyway. Again, if they're making bad decisions over and over and over again because they are underfueled, fatigued, that is your sign probably not necessarily to wait around. That's my opinion on it, and that's an opinion.
I want to jump onto the back of this, and this might be a little bit rogue, but bear with me. Taking this discussion into how many of us have had clients or ourselves as athletes have been through something that we might consider traumatic in our own personal lives, breakups, fired from your job, death in the family. How many of us have been through something like that, and that has therefore transferred into our training and negatively affected it and potentially caused an injury? Like, so for me, I've competed before. My post-comp blues get so bad, it generally forms an injury. Like, that's something I have repeated for essentially 2 years, which is crazy now I think about it. But anyone else have any experience in this realm?
I was gonna I was gonna answer Lucy's question. Yeah, I think some externals take longer to essentially like resolve. Like, speaking of like from experience, like when I lost my dad, like that was years of externals of like just being able to resolve that. And I think it does come down to what Emilia said of like being upfront with your athlete, and like if it's an external, you can change it. If it's just bad sleep for like weeks, like that's something we can easily change. But if it's something massive like that, I think being upfront with them, like if it's something you can manage, let's give that a shot. If not, then we have to look at your training and change that.
I was gonna, piggyback off of that, of like, we treat the athletes as human first and take everything into account first. And like, if they are unable to reach the basic standards of externals because of whatever reason, like, it has to be communicated that their goals that they have may not be reached as fast as they want them to because of these externals. But when it is more like they're just not completing them just because they're not completing them, I think that almost the same conversation has to be made of these goals that you have set. You almost can't complain that you're not reaching them because you're not doing the work outside of training to, get you there. There was one more thing I was going to say about that. Oh, but yes, when it is like a major, like, life event, like a death, like a breakup, anything like that, I think that the training needs to be adjusted almost like immediately, depending on the severity of the situation, if they are unable to be meeting those externals. So, but agree with all of your takes here.
I'll put a pin in mine because I'll make a point after Ryan, and then to keep us moving, I'm going to go on something else as well. So Ryan, you go.
I think it's heavily so if we're talking about something like life-changing or something like quite traumatic, I think it depends on the temperament of the individual and how we manage that. So I know a couple of my guys who have recently gone through some unfortunate events. I know like they use the gym as a coping mechanism, and I know they're very sensible. So I didn't have to change too much. It was just a case of not overly checking in on them, but just making sure that is everything that we've set achievable for where you are right now. And 9 times out of 10, they go, if I didn't have this, or if we had actually changed our goalpost, that would probably make me feel worse within their own element. For me, when I went through something about a year ago, I probably became very rash from my training because I let emotions get to me. So again, there's certain types of situations where you have to measure the temperament of the person and then adjust how you manage that person, in the sense so that they don't go in and don't do something silly and then don't get themselves injured from that. Just want to add that in there as well.
I always love when Ryan says something. It's just a thing of beauty. The one thing I wanted to add is I wrote down unreliable narrator. And so I think this is something that's important when we take athletes' perceptions on board. And so if you say to someone, and I've had this conversation not only with people in this call, but with many athletes, where it will be, hey, there's this massive life stressor and there are symptoms of it in training, and being like, okay, how do you feel about tolerating this at the moment, and whatever degree of conversation. And the follow-up will be them saying, I have it under wraps, I'm actually doing okay. Sometimes bullshit, and not because they're trying to lie, but because we are unreliable narrators in our own story of being like, I'm doing okay is the fallacy we tell ourselves because we don't want to deal with the symptom, and understandably so. And so like often, how many times have you guys known I'm stressed versus we all know if I'm stressed, I'm actually really, really stressed, because I don't like to admit it. And that's very normal for a lot of people. So I think one thing to make sure of is if we consider the thing significant, regardless of the story we are then told by the athlete, if the symptoms are prevalent, if they think they're okay, they're probably still not okay, and making space for that. One of the big things that there are so many notes, I promise not to go through all of them. There's a big area that I think most coaches make mistakes in. I've been privy to this as well. We were talking about, you gave the example of rotator cuff and saying, basically, has your bench volume just skyrocketed? And there's two different areas in that I not have issue with, but becomes an issue. One is the time frame in which that volume has increased, and so we don't derive the increase as being the problem. And so it's like, well, it wasn't like, no, we've been doing this for like numerous weeks, and then you look and actually the block prior, it's like a 30% increase. And so like how far back we derive that. The second thing is there is a significant difference between top end strength and then the volume tolerances to that equivalent strength. And so post competition is probably the biggest time frame, right, where you see someone go, I just squatted 200 kilos. Sorry, I'm using your max. It's not actually relevant to you, but that's just a flex. She squats 200. Yay. Is someone squats 200 and we go, cool, we're going to volume. Well, at the same E1 or M, we can take 160 for sixes, and then we can watch you die. And so really what I think one of the things people make mistake with is after competition, understanding that the work you did to get to that top end is still the work you are able to achieve. It does not mean that just by proxy, you can now do massive amount of more like higher intensity work. And I think that's a really common mistake. But the question to you, Emilia, is the backtrack. So in what time frame would you say an increase in volume is the most relevant? Like, where is that window?
So my typical one off of that, if you're going to go through, again, physio brain here and like actual physiology, is going to be 3 months backwards, because that's when we're looking at tendon development. If you're looking 3 months backwards, you were within the time frame that tendons potentially, it does depend who you are, haven't fully developed based off of any sort of increase in strength that you have achieved. And so if the typical one that you see is someone has a growth spurt of strength and all of a sudden, because you've increased intensity or volume and it's going really well for them, and then about 4 weeks later, you then see a tendon specific injury sort of then come up where it's like overuse. It's typically a really pinching pain near a joint. My tendons are shock. And then we backtrack, okay, well, whereabouts did this sort of happen? And it never looks as bad as what it sort of is, in terms of it looks like, oh, well, obviously I continued pushing the athlete when they did really well in strength and they were responding really well. And if you can catch it quickly, it's fantastic, because you go, okay, all we've got to do, decrease volume back to sort of a tiny bit, really. They tend to develop over the coming then 4 to 6 weeks, and then you push again and you bang on the money. The issue comes when lifters don't bring it up to you guys, unfortunately, and then those questions aren't asked, and then you end up 3 months later where a lifter has been pushing through a tendon issue, and then they're going into that stage of, oh, now this is just becoming a pain cycle. I'm benching, it hurts, I've got a sore shoulder that's now no longer specific, and now we're in this this point where it's actually really quite hard to rehab. So if you're getting pain and it's that sort of pain where they've had a quick increase in strength, that is your time to pick up on it and pick up on it quick, because if you leave it, it's really annoying.
I'm going to piggyback off of what Callum said as well about like the end of competition and then people just chucking lots of volume in. That's also a relevant point where I have lots of conversations with my athletes. If they hit a PB at the end of their block, and then the expectation or their expectation is, well, I've hit a PB, so like the percentages that we work off is off of a new PB. Does that make sense? So if we're working off of, I don't know, an E1RM or 1RM of 260 for a deadlift, and they hit 265 at the end of their block, and they automatically go, well, we're going to work on this new load. And I'm just there like, well, no, that's what you got for, a 1RM. But that doesn't mean that we have to increase the amount of volume to intensity relationship. There's a way of saying this and I can't get it across. But I think there's a major misconception in athletes out there that PB increases, I can automatically increase the amount of volume that I can accumulate or work percentages off of. Does that make sense?
It does. I think also another really simple representation of it is someone ends the block somewhere, and so they believe the next block should start similar, and being like, oh, you've completely lost the fucking track. Like I squatted 132, so we're good. So I'll start like 125, 127 and be like, you have no idea how hard it was for your body to adjust over 4 weeks to be able to display that and then return to like some degree of base level. So we don't linger on points. You're good if I just keep moving through. Sick. Okay. So there's something you said and it raised a question for me. So we consider technique to be subjective, but we speak like efficiency is objective. So because we say like technique is always going to be variable depending on the person. And then we have the bias of what we think good technique is. But we always say that it can be more efficient. So we have a bias as to what like efficiency is, right? So that means certain joint stacking of certain positions. In essence, I'm asking, what's the difference?
It's a hard one, isn't it? I would say that efficient can look different on every lifter. And so that is where that then becomes very objective, but in a sense of subjectivity. Objective in the sense of that objective does not look the same on everyone. So everyone can have a different level of efficient. Not everyone can have a different level of what is categorized to that person as a good technique. And so that to me would be the difference, is looking at the efficiency of the lift for that person versus a broad diagnosis of what a good technique looks like across everybody, and that technique will be specific. That level of good technique will be individual to every coach, what they think a good technique looks like, and so that's the difference. It's sort of the same, it's slightly different, but how much you are putting your own thoughts and ideas into what that technique should look like versus what you can actually separate from what you think it should be and what the athlete actually works with.
I'll let Lucy add, but I've tried to summarize what you said with a sentence, which is effective. Because I agree, by the way, I'm trying to get you to say the thing, which is we're talking about what is efficient within what is available to that athlete.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Lucy, go ahead.
I was literally just gonna, you've already said this. I was literally just gonna say, if we look at like, okay, fair enough, they're the elite, but if we look at people like Tiff, who has an outrageous squat in comparison to like what a normal typical squat actually looks like very narrow, she's very petite. You wouldn't necessarily look at someone like a new athlete and give them that squat stance as their first. Like eventually, you know, their joints might adjust, their muscles might grow in a way that they do just suit a more narrow squat, but hers is narrow on like a major side. And that's kind of what this point kind of as a visual looks like, that you look at Tiff as one of the best squatters in the world. Technically, not for me. Like, that's not how I'm gonna squat. That's not how I'm gonna program my squat unless, you know, I have someone that's similar to it. But it works and it's efficient for her. And like, how can you argue with that?
So sorry if this is like a little bit of a random question, and especially because I don't deal with the programming side of things, but I know you talked about how like there are specific tests that have been done in the past that aren't necessarily correlated with the injury. However, are there screening tests or movements or things that are beneficial to have as a baseline? Like, for example, to go with your screening form, to have a baseline of specific movements or mobility issues. Is there anything like that that is good to know baseline before the injuries happen?
So in terms of specific, like what we in physio would call like a special test, I am going to say no. And the reason is I will use some of them very occasionally, as long as if they're online, Ryan will now know this, if I can watch them doing the test and so I can see that the test has been done correctly. Or I know extremely well on how to do said test. I think that if I'm honest with you, the reason why the tests are often not very good at diagnosing or ruling in or out anything is because they are so easy to get wrong, and they are so easy to not like ask the correct questions when doing them, and people don't understand what you mean when you're saying, does this hurt in a sharp way, does this hurt in a achy way? And so it's really hard to get right. So special tests, we are pretty much in physio now basically phasing them out. I would say the older generation of physios, it's worked for them their whole life. I don't have anything against it, but I would say the newer generation of physios and the research that's coming out now is more saying probably stay away from them. In terms of just if you are going to do any movement screening, it is looking for obvious differences side to side in movement and strength. And so it is the really basic things that we would often always skip over. Do both of your arms go the same level up above your head? Is there an obvious difference between the two of them? Can you reach both of your arms up behind your back to the same level? Can you cross one leg over your knee and the other leg over your knee? All of the things that, is there anything obvious in your movement patterns that are coming up? They're all of the things that, yes, you could use if you really wanted to, but in terms of using specific tests for specific diagnosis, I'm going to say no, because I steer away from it. I am a very, I'm going to say simple physio in the way of when something needs strengthening, I'll strengthen it. And when something needs mobilizing, I'll mobilize it. I'm not going to start, unless it's really complex, I'm not going to start going into any more nuance than that, which makes me sound really dumb, but it works typically every time, because it's the simple things that work. And then when you start getting into, okay, well, does this work for this person? Does this work for this person? Usually no. Callum, I reckon you're good to go again.
Yeah, don't ask me notes, guys. Come on. I think because there's not that long left, I'll ask one of the bigger questions, which is a kind of game of physio. So
great, can't wait. Fire ahead.
This is one you and I have spoken about. So how I phrase this might question morals, but we'll see if I get it right. So you have a lifter who has an issue. By Now, it is significant. Let's just say it's anything from, in fact, there's too many injuries. You get the principle. It's significant. We talk about people losing time in the sport, and especially if you diagnose someone with something, they see themselves as fragile and so on. There's a very big issue of how we frame things and diagnose things to when they just give up. And you and I have spoken about this a bit, where something's happened with an athlete and you're like, I'm gonna have to tell them to stop entirely. And I'm like, I agree. But when we tell them that, they will quit. And it's normally things like, it's completely unfortunate, and normally that's exactly what's happened, which is understandably so. But do you think there's like more nuance to how you frame the physio work to be done? So I'll give a really simple example to kind of make the point of like framing to someone, not that we got to stop squatting, but I think I'd like to temporarily shift focus. So rather than saying we're going to stop squatting and be like, I think you should shift focus to a bit more deadlift work to support this, reduce the squat for a block and see that support it. But like, obviously that framing doesn't work particularly well, but you see what I mean? Like, because of what stopping really means to most people.
Yeah, so a bit similar to the question that Katie just asked, I'm going to use the same sort of like phrase of, this is where I have changed my practice a lot in the past year. Because when you start giving these diagnoses to individuals, that is when scary things come up in people's heads. And it often, the scary thing often is way scarier than what it actually is when you actually dumb it right back down. And so a rotator cuff tear, you can also phrase as a weak shoulder muscle, and a quadriceps tendinopathy, you can also frame as a overloaded quad. And so it makes it much easier for the athlete to understand, well, if something's overloaded, okay, well, we need to reduce the load and then build it back up again. If something is weak, we need to strengthen it progressively, because if it's sore, we need to make it not sore. And so it's all of those sorts of things of like, yes, I agree with what like Callum says here, in the fact that the shifting focus and making things really simple and not overcomplicating it with a diagnosis is very helpful when we're dealing with these sorts of athletes. I struggle a lot with it when it comes to things that are very hard to dumb down. When you were talking about disc injuries and larger, like, let's say ruptures, that is very hard to then say to someone, oh, don't worry, you've got a weak shoulder. Like when you've got a full rupture in the rotator cuff, like that obviously is very, very, very rare. When it comes to those people, I do tend to still lean onto the side of, I'm going to tell them they can then make up their mind of what they need to do with that. Because if they were to carry on, let's say, a rupture, because I've told them that they've got a weak shoulder and we need to shift focus, I can get myself into quite a lot of trouble. And so that is where I sort of draw the line. But anything where I'm like, no, this person can continue training, and even if they were to try and push boundaries slightly further, yes, they will get pain, but it's not going to be detrimental in the future. That's where I can be like, yes, we can shift focus for a little while, rather than me telling them the whole truth.
Can I jump in on that? This is more of a question for you, Emilia, for possibly what you might have seen, obviously in your year of practice. Is telling the difference between like a full-on rupture to an athlete compared to like a strain in some regard. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I like to know what I've done. Like I like to know what the injury is, or what was happening. So do you find that conversation where, okay, if you've got a full-on rupture, if you've got a tricep tear or something like that, something that's evidently physical, is that then an easier conversation in the route to getting back into the sport, compared to someone who has no idea what the hell is happening, and we are on a guesswork? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it depends on who that athlete is, and this is where you guys, like, to be honest with you, come on board so quickly with me. It's when I start discussing with you, hopefully, ideally, before. So if it's an athlete who's got a really serious injury, I typically do get a message from them saying, I've had this injury, I'm going to book in, which is ideal, because then I can talk to their coach beforehand and say, what's going on? Do you know this athlete? Do you think that what they're saying is 100% specific, like credible? Do you think that they are potentially hypervigilating over something? Because if it is something where you guys are like, no, this person's really straightforward, which I think quite a lot of us have had now discussions about your athletes where they are really straightforward and they are really good with how their pain responds and really good with telling what is going on in their body, then yes, I'll tell them. Because it is then, as you said, easier for them to come back on board with the process. They actually understand how serious an injury can be when it is that serious. They do then follow a protocol very strictly, and that is ideal for me. When it is someone who is, I don't want to say known for, but when it is someone who is known for overdiagnosing themselves and giving themselves lots of self-diagnosis and being very fear avoidant with movement, so where they've been told by previous physios that they can still keep moving and they've decided not to, that is when I get to have a discussion with you guys and say, where do we go with this lifter? What is best for them? What is in their best interests? And then we move from there. Again, there isn't any lying involved there. It is just a framing it in a slightly different way.
Thank you.
So there's something I wrote in the midst of Ryan's question. This is not targeted at you, Ryan. It's just the way you phrased it. You know, because lifters say the thing you said. Now for you, obviously, it doesn't apply because you do. But but I want to know. Like, so you know, people being like, I want to know what that is. I wrote down, but you don't, which is just so you know when someone's like, no, I want to know, and you're like, okay, well, you have supraspinatus impingement injury. And they go, oh, I'll never walk again. Like they have no idea what thing. So I'm saying it doesn't apply to you, Ryan, because obviously your depth of knowledge is far too superior to most people. But what I mean is, with most athletes, they think they know by being given a label, and what that means normally is they go back to that familial bias or the social bias they've built up of terminology they don't understand in a situation that is completely irrelevant. And so, like, someone hears, oh, you've got like L5 irritation. I'll just make a fucking thing up. And then they're like, oh, low back pain. Yeah, that runs in my family. Like, people make shit up because they believe it. And so, like, I have such a bias towards diagnosis of just like how people interpret things they don't understand. So Ryan, truly not you, I swear.
The other thing to mention there as well is the amount of times that I've given people after they have asked me for a specific diagnosis, a lengthy description as to what their diagnosis is, and provided them with resources that they can go away and research, and they look at none of it and they continue to take their social bias on board, is a joke. Because I have spent like countless hours typing out, this is what your diagnosis means. Don't worry about this part of it because this bit doesn't apply to you. Worry about this part of it because this bit applies to you. These are the reasons why we're doing your rehab, and these are the reasons why you need to stop overloading this part of your bed. They don't read any of it, and then they just say, well, I'm not going to lift because I've got lower back pain. And you go, why did I bother? Why did I bother? Well, I could have just said you've got a weak back, and they would have done the same thing. And so it's that nuance between different lifters.
I guess the other issue that could come of that as well is they go down rabbit holes. Like they can go down massive rabbit holes of, oh, Emilia said it was this. And then they get like fucking, you know, everything on the sun that's on the internet, and they go, I'm broken.
Oh, the amount of videos I've been watching this piriformis release video on YouTube that I've been told you're meant to be doing 5 times a day. I'm like, fantastic. You're going to hurt at the end of today. Like that. It's so frustrating.
So there's 2 bits that I want to add, and if anyone has to shoot, so I understand it's the end of the hour, feel free to. But I think 2 things that all athletes should actually take into consideration off the back of this, which is one, if you work with a genuine practitioner, is effectively shut up and listen, because there's way too much of either self-diagnosis, your own opinion that you have no qualifications for, you believe is more valid. You're given rehab that you do not do with information you do not read. And being like, if you take it seriously and you actually want these things as bad as you want, and you do none of that, I would just say you don't actually care as much as you say. That includes me, by the way, because Emilia has to tell me off fucking all the time. And so, yeah, I take that. The second thing, which I think is really important, is relationship with pain. 4 injuries per 1,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's phrase this as unfairly as possible. It's like, suck it up. Of like, if you expect to not be in pain and get strong, go do something else. And I'll say another sport, but I can't because they all have pain. Is like, in order to excel, your relationship with pain needs to drastically improve. And so I'm an advocate of having a very good relationship with both suffering and pain, which never sounds pretty, but I think is aggressively true. And most people, what you were saying before is, you said the people who, and you were like, the people who like, what we mean is the people who just are appalling with pain. They have a very bad relationship. Anything happens, they're like, oh, I'm dying. And it's just having a better relationship to like, pain will happen. You are okay, predominantly a signal, and just information to work with, but that's going to happen.
I just wanted to jump in there, and for everyone else that's also thinking this, that some people have higher pain tolerances than others. Some people don't train when they have mouth issues. Some people don't train when they have a broken hand. There is a standard, but like,
What are you talking about?
some of it's okay. Some of it's okay to talk about.
Right.
To take a step back.
Sometimes it's okay. If you've got surgery, you can have a day off. That's
yeah,
it.
day.
Also, actually, now we're like on the topic, if you guys have got lifters who do want to say that they want to not give up, but want to take a break from squats, bench, or deadlifts, my one thing to say back to them is, brilliant. You have now just taken away our only data point as to whether or not you are getting better. If you have got an athlete who has got pain with deadlifting and they've been to see a physio and they've told them to stop deadlifting but start doing rehab, we don't know if the rehab is helping if we never test a deadlift until the next time they deadlift, at which point we don't know what worked and what didn't. Did the rest in deadlifts did the rest of deadlifts just make the difference, or was it something else that made the difference? If we're not testing it week on week, we don't know what's changed there. And so that is a really important thing to just, if someone is fear avoidant, which happens loads, we need the points to sort of go back and look at. It's not easier said than done, by the way, because lifters don't listen to us, so sometimes.
And just as the disclaimer, yes, I will admit my enjoyment of pain is not okay for everyone. The rest of you can grow up. Okay, happy?
Happy.
Beautiful.